Now, staying with this story, for more on this, we are now being joined by Major General Ashok Mehta. General, thank you so much for joining us. Some tragic news pouring in, of course, about the demise of General Bipin Rawat in the chopper crash, along with other members also on board. What more can you tell us? Can you share some personal anecdotes and memories, especially the legacy that he leaves behind?
Well, as you know, he is India's first Chief of Defence Staff. This is a post that was created by this government 75 years after independence. And as Chief of Defence Staff, he was presiding over the most transformative changes in the architecture of the national security and defense apparatus. The defense reforms process under him, both while he was Chief of Army Staff and more significantly as the Chief of Defense Staff, are absolutely landmark. And not just the plans for theaterization, the integration, the jointness, and the modernization of the armed forces. In fact, I have known General Rawat for many years. I knew his father too. They both are from the Gurkha regiment. He commanded 511 Gurkhas.
Right.
His father commanded the same battalion, and I am from the Gurkha regiment. And we used to meet several times. When he became the Chief of Defence Staff, my last meeting was with him was on 18th of October in his office, just before I was leaving for Nepal. And he shared with me the fact that the theaterization plan would be ready within 6 months. And he showed me his Charter of Duties. And in the Charter of Duties, his responsibility as Chief of Defence Staff was to have a plan ready for implementation within 3 years of jointness, i.e. the theaterization. Okay. There were some people who did not approve of jointness. I mean, we've known this for a long time, that the Air Force has always objected to the jointness plan, as it relegates the Air Force to a support arm. That is their perception. And therefore, the Air Force has historically opposed this. Chief of Defence Staff Bipin Rawat did try, and I think he has succeeded in convincing the Air Force that the Air Force will not become a subordinate entity, but will be an independent strike force, as the Air Force has always wanted. And due to the limitation in the number of the Air Force squadrons, the Air Force will be parceled out to the various theatre commands. But the Air Force, unlike the other arms, doesn't have to be physically co-located. The Air Force can be in Jamnagar and it can fly to East Ladakh. The Air Force can be in Lucknow and fly to Trivandrum.
Absolutely.
So the limitations of the...
Right. Just talking a little more about the CDS post, which is, of course, was recommended after the Kargil war. It took a whole 2 decades for it to be institutionalized, as CDS General Rawat was essentially the one-man military advisor to the government. Perhaps you could elaborate more on this.
The Chief of Defence Staff General Rawat had the unique distinction of holding 4 posts simultaneously. He was the single, as CDS, he became the single point advisor to the defense minister. He was the head of the newly created Department of Military Affairs. He was the chair of the Defense Policy Group, and he was also the head of the Integrated Defense Staff. So in terms of his remit, it was huge. And the fact that he had to do this exercise for implementation of jointness, of bringing out these theater commands, converting 17 commands into what will essentially become 3 army commands, 1 maritime theater command, and an air defense command. So this compression of and unification of the military will be a great asset in reducing cost, and therefore money will be available, hopefully, for modernization. General Rawat's other contributions include his conduct as in his presentations, because he's now been able to convince the people of this country, and more importantly the armed forces, because no change is palatable to people who have gotten used to a certain way of life.
Absolutely, right.
And these changes are absolutely seismic changes, unthinkable in the past, and therefore there has been resistance. But General Rawat, I think to a large extent, was able to convince the naysayers, that whatever is being done in the supreme national interest and the interest of the armed forces.
Absolutely. Sir, just before we wrap up our discussion very quickly, just enlightening our viewers a little more about General Rawat's prolific career. He also led his troops not only in India but also on UN peacekeeping missions. Can you tell us a little bit more about the same?
Yeah, actually, General Bipin Rawat, many people would not know that in 2015, when there was an ambush on the border between Nagaland and Burma, and 14 Dogra battalion was ambushed and they lost about 20 people, it was he who launched as the corps commander in Dimapur. And I recall I met him there at that time, just before this raid was conducted, this retaliatory raid after our troops were ambushed. He was the one who initiated what the government then called hot pursuit. It was a very successful raid carried out by 21 para special forces. Unfortunately, that same battalion is involved in this tragic ambush on the border in Nagaland last week, in which 14 civilians were killed. General Rawat was also the president of the Gurkha Brigade. As you know, the Indian Army has the largest contingent of Gurkhas, mainly from Nepal, who serve in the Indian Army. There are something like 43 infantry battalions, and General Rawat was the president of the Gurkha Brigade. And as a veteran from the Gurkha regiment, I used to frequently interact with him on how to improve the careers of the serving Gurkhas as well as the ex-servicemen in Nepal.